Okay, this is Mrs. Richardson. Welcome back to US History Lecture videos. We've been talking a lot about the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, the first New Deal, the second New Deal. And today we're going to shift and start transitioning into World War II. So today's lesson is going to just discuss how the United States went from isolation to global conflict with World War II. I also just want to point out that many historians argue that World War II was what really solidly ended the Great Depression. And who knows what would have happened to the US economy without a world war. So today's goals: explain the factors in Europe that gave rise to fascism and Nazism, discuss the events in Europe and Asia that led to the start of the war, and identify the early steps taken by the president to increase American aid while not completely joining the war. So, in order to fully understand World War II, it's also important to understand what happened between World War I and World War II. There were some unresolved things that partially led to World War II, along with the German Nazi leader, Adolf Hitler, which you have most likely heard of. The period between World War I and World War II was chaotic, especially in Europe. Europe was struggling to recover from the war. Germany was given much of the blame for World War I and much of the repercussions, both financially and sort of, socially, internationally being shamed for starting World War I. And so the German economy was really struggling. President Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I hoped the League of Nations would prevent future wars, but instead the world faced economic collapse, the rise of dictatorship, and the path toward another global conflict. And by the time we get to 1939, the US can no longer stay isolated from the world events. So most Americans wanted to focus on their own problems. It's kind of a story we've heard before, right? With World War I, we didn't want to get involved. There's a whole ocean between us and Europe, and we wanted to stay out of it. This was a similar trend that we see leading up to World War II. Most Americans didn't want to get involved in European affairs. The U.S. did end up fighting in World War I, and many people felt like we shouldn't have done that, and we certainly shouldn't do it again. Americans also feared that helping other nations would drag them into another war, so the government passed several neutrality acts to keep the country out of foreign conflicts. However, the U.S. continued to intervene in the Western Hemisphere in other ways that were directly war. So some of the early peace efforts that failed was the Washington Naval Conference in the 1920s. This conference reduced the size of navies for 9 nations, including the United States. There was the Four-Power Treaty of 1921, promising that the United States, Britain, and France and Japan would not expand in Asia. In 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact declared war an international crime. But these agreements ultimately failed because no nation agreed to punish countries that broke the rules. So without enforcement, the treaties were ineffective to stopping aggressive nations from pursuing their goals. So the Great Depression, while we focused on how it affected America, there was also an economic depression in Europe during this time. Industrialized countries around the world faced severe unemployment and poverty. And these economic desperate conditions created the perfect conditions for dictators to rise to power. People who are desperate and angry become willing to do and support more radical things. So we begin to see the rise of fascism. So Italy had economic problems even before the Great Depression began. And it kind of created an opening for Benito Mussolini to create basically a kind of a new Italy. He promised a totalitarian, can't talk, a state, basically shifting Italy to a country where everything is controlled by the government, much more of a dictatorship. Okay. And Italian industrialists and the king supported him because they were afraid of communist movements. Mussolini became the prime minister in 1922 and transformed Italy into a one-party state by 1927. So really rising to power and kind of trying to ensure that he remains in power. The rise of Nazism in Germany. Okay, so Germany faced severe political and economic problems. It was not a good time to be German. The Treaty of Versailles created deep resentment. Remember, this was the treaty that ended World War I and basically put down in writing that Germany was to blame for World War I. Germans also feared the growing strength of the Communist Party, and this led an opening for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to step in and promise to restore German greatness. And you can read some more in your textbook if you're really interested in how someone like Adolf Hitler gained so much power. Part of it was who he was. He was an extremely intelligent, charismatic speaker. And he was very, very effective at putting down all of his opposition before it had a chance to really oppose him. He also was very persuasive. So it was a blend of who Adolf Hitler was, being able to persuade people to his side, whether they fully understood what his side was or not, before it was quote unquote too late, putting down any opposition before it was really allowed to speak out, and also the circumstances of the country, right? People were desperate, and desperation can lead you to make decisions without fully thinking them through. And by 1933, the Nazis became the largest party in the German legislature, so they're dominating German government. The president of Germany appointed Hitler as chancellor in 1933, and he used, once he was in that powerful position, he used something called the Enabling Act to become the dictator with complete power. So he sort of manipulated the system and the people to get into a position of enough power to then seize the rest of the power for himself and take over Germany. Once he had power, he began rebuilding Germany's military strength. He withdrew from the League of Nations. Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles. He invaded Austria, claiming he wanted to unite all ethnic Germans. And so, as a consequence of invading Austria and Hitler continuing to violate the treaty that had been put into place after World War I, different countries had to decide how they were going to deal with that. Britain and France agreed to let Germany take a section of land, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, from Czechoslovakia in order to appease Hitler without going to war. However, he soon occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia as well, proving that appeasing him was not going to work. He was not going to be appeased. In 1935, Hitler's government passed a series of laws that stripped the Jewish people of German citizenship and their rights, and was the beginning of taking away their ability to fight back. Okay, we'll talk more about that. We're kind of going big picture here. In Japan, we also see dictatorships rising. Japanese militarists took control of Japan in the 1930s. Japan wanted to build an empire and feared the spread of communism. So they started making some decisions. They created Manchukuo, which was a puppet state made from a Chinese territory, and the League of Nations protested but took no action. Then 6 years later, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which again, I'm not going to go into details. This was the Japanese violating the treaty, led to a full-scale invasion of China. And the Japanese soldiers committed many terrible atrocities. And then around this time period, Japan and Germany started working together and signed a pact against communism. A year later, Italy joined this pact. So these three major militarist dictator-led countries joined together in their fight against communism, which created the Axis powers, which is essentially what the United States and its allies are going to fight against in World War II. Okay, so neutrality versus helping the allies. President FDR understood the danger that Nazi Germany and Japan proposed to the world, but Congress and the American people wanted to remain neutral, and he was facing a lot of opposition from people in Congress who wanted to stay out of it. And Congress, in fact, passed the Neutrality Act, which banned selling weapons to warring nations. Another Neutrality Act outlawed loaning money to countries at war, and a third Neutrality Act outlawed transporting weapons or passengers on American ships to warring nations. So this made it very difficult for Roosevelt to help because he couldn't provide money, loans, or weapons. So he found creative ways to help. Since Japan never formally declared war on China, he could send supplies to China, and he did so. In 1941, Congress authorized the Lend-Lease program, which allowed the United States to sell, lease, or transfer weapons to nations important to American defense. So as long as he was able to sort of like dance around who was at war with each other, he could sort of get involved by supporting the side that he wanted to support. And as he continued to do so, American neutrality kind of came to an end here, right? If you're distributing $45 billion worth of supplies, you've chosen a side. And that is essentially what FDR did. All right. So in August of 1941, President Roosevelt met with the British Prime Minister off the coast of Canada, and they drafted what was called the Atlantic Charter, which outlined their vision for the world after the war. It stated the U.S. and Britain sought no territory from the war. It promised that all people should have the right to choose their own government. It called for lowering trade barriers and freedom of the seas, and renounced using force to settle disputes. So trying to create peace and agreeing to work together to, in this war, bring war to an end, essentially. Now, the final straw, Japan chose to attack America directly. This is where we get the Pearl Harbor bombing. Okay. Why? By 1941, American embargoes were putting pressure on Japan. Japan needed oil from the Dutch Indies to continue its expansion. And Japan realized that attacking the Dutch Indies directly might bring American intervention. So Japanese leaders decided to trick the United States by negotiating with them while planning a war. The U.S. instead demanded that Japan withdraw from China, which Japan said absolutely not. And they set a deadline for a peaceful solution. And then when no agreement was reached, Japan decided to attack. And this is where we get the attack, the famous attack of December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. So on a Sunday morning, Japanese planes surprise attacked the naval station in Pearl Harbor. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, so the ships that carried the airplanes close enough to where they could reach with their fuel capacity, had secretly sailed to the Central Pacific. And 2 waves of attacks brought 353 fighters, bombers, and torpedo bombers down on unprepared Americans. All 8 battleships were hit, 4 of them were sunk. 200 American aircraft were destroyed, and 2,400 American servicemen were killed, with an additional 1,100 wounded. The Japanese lost only 29 planes and 5 submarines. So this was a massive shock attack that the United States did not see coming. And this direct attack was more than sufficient for America to step back from neutrality and fully engage in the war, right? A direct attack required retaliation. So President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress has now changed its tune after this and is more than happy to vote to declare war on Japan. Once we declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States, and now we are fully involved in World War II. So we'll continue talking about that as we move forward in time. We'll talk a little bit more about World War II specifically, right? But Pearl Harbor was really the key event here that switched it, changed everything.